Again, my name is Alejandro Vivas, and I am a public participation specialist for the Office of Environmental Equity here at the Department of Toxic Substances Control. On behalf of the department, I'd like to welcome you all to today's workshop. Very happy that you joined us. We know that everybody's busy, and taking time out of your schedule is very much appreciated. So quickly, I just want to go ahead and let people know about the language and captions that will be available today. This workshop will be broadcast in English and Spanish, and each participant must select their preferred language to hear the meeting. Audio interpretation is available through Zoom. Click the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen or the Zoom app to select your language. Automated closed captions have been turned on for this meeting, but if you'd like to turn them off, please click the CC icon or move the captions box. So please, if you could use Google Chrome, Safari, or Firefox, that'd be very helpful for this meeting, or this workshop, I should say. And we'd like all our questions to be submitted to the presenters via the question and answer box, or the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of the screen. The camera and microphone features for the attendees has been disabled, but again, we will have some more opportunities to ask questions and have a genuine back and forth with our team. And please, as a reminder, this session will be recorded. So we will make this available on our website, and people will have an opportunity to go back and take a look at this workshop again. And please, if you would make sure and complete a evaluation of our session at the end of the workshop, we'd very much appreciate it. That way we can get a better idea as to how we can improve in the future. There we go. We have some information as far as our contacts. You can find our email address, dtsc_hwplan@dtsc.ca.gov if you'd like to contact us. You'll see that we have our hazardous waste management plan link for you as well. If you have any issues getting to that, or for whatever reason have any further clarification questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We have included a link to that in the chat so that you can easily take a click on that, and it'll direct you to our site. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ryan Dominguez. He's a supervising hazardous waste engineer here for DTSC, and he's going to take the reins and get this workshop started. Ryan?
Great. Thank you, Alejandro. Hi, everybody. My name is Ryan Dominguez. I'm the supervisor for the Hazardous Waste Management Plan Unit. Thanks for joining us today. For those of you who have been involved with this project from the beginning, welcome back. For those who are new, welcome. Since first starting focused discussion about hazardous waste management reporting in the summer of 2022, we've received many comments, questions, and recommendations from you. In addition, many of you have been participating in various meetings related to DTSC and our work, including Board of Environmental Safety meetings or in other public meetings. Your participation has been energizing, and we encourage you to stay engaged. Today is our first workshop that we are having solely for planning. The intent of this workshop is to use information included in the November report to begin forward-thinking conversations about hazardous waste management in California. If you haven't read the report, please do. You can find it on our website, and it provides background for the information that will be discussed today. Now, throughout the presentation, we will give updates about specific focus areas that will provide information for questions and recommendations that we've received from you. These have led to overarching and interesting conversations about things such as in-state versus out-of-state management of hazardous waste, how hazardous wastes are identified in California, opportunities for waste reduction, the connections of property development and housing to remediation, what the current capacity and regulatory landscape is for recycling and treatment of hazardous waste, and a need to work towards a circular economy. So with that, thanks again for the continued participation, and I will go ahead and turn it over to Felice down at the end.
Thank you, Ryan. My name is Felice Takamatsu. I am the Associate Governmental Program Analyst for the Hazardous Waste Management Plan Unit, and we want to welcome you to our update workshop about the plan. We're excited for this opportunity to share an update on the work our unit has been doing transitioning from the report to the plan. Next slide, please. So our goals for this workshop are to share the approach and process for the development of the 2025 Hazardous Waste Management Plan and to receive public feedback. We're hoping that this workshop kicks off the development of future workshops in the summer for further discussions about various focus areas and topics. The agenda today is as follows. We'll first be reviewing where we've been, and this includes a recap of the 2023 Hazardous Waste Management Report and a summary of the feedback we've received so far. Then we'll go into sharing an overview of our approach and process for the development of the first Hazardous Waste Management Plan due in March of 2025. And finally, we will present a roadmap about the next steps. And as we go through the presentation today, there will be stopping points to hear public feedback as well. So we'll start by recapping where we've been, providing a reminder of what we've been doing and including what we've heard from you. Next slide, please. In 2021, Senate Bill 158 was approved and made changes to Health and Safety Code 25135. The changes require the department to complete hazardous waste management reports that will feed information into hazardous waste management plans. So as you can see here, in 2023, DTSC published the first hazardous waste management report. DTSC is using the information in the report to develop the first hazardous waste management plan by 2025. And the plan will be presented to the Board of Environmental Safety for approval. Then the cycle starts again, as hazardous waste management reports and plans are due every 3 years. So after the approval of the 2025 plan, our team will begin developing the next report that'll be due in 2026, and this will lead into the next plan that'll be due in 2028, and so on, and as this is a continuous process. Next slide, please. The release of the first report marked the beginning of renewed and forward-thinking conversations about ways in which Californians generate and manage hazardous waste across the state. We utilized prior work completed in the Community Protection and Hazardous Waste Reduction Initiative to help guide the start of our data collection and other research. We collected and analyzed available information related to hazardous waste generation, transportation, treatment, and disposal. And while collecting information, we reported our findings at workshops held in both 2022 and 2023. And we received comments and were able to utilize some to help inform pieces of research. Next slide, please. As a reminder, as Ryan had mentioned, you can access our full report on our webpage. There's a QR code on this slide that you are able to utilize to connect to our webpage. And we recommend reading the full report and reviewing all the appendices, as data from the report is being used to inform the development of the plan. Next slide, please. All right, so now we'll get into what we've heard. So prior to publishing the report, we held workshops and had a public feedback period for the draft hazardous waste management report to receive public comments and questions. All the comments and questions received are published in Appendix F of the 2023 report. Next slide, please. So out of all the feedback collected, 163 were questions or comments that were plan related. And in our review of the feedback, these are the general feedback themes we found. We are incorporating these themes to draft our recommendations for the 2025 plan. Next slide, please. Next, we will go over our approach and process for the hazardous waste management plan. And to start, we will explain what the plan is intended to do. Next slide, please. So the first hazardous waste management plan will serve, the hazardous waste management plan will serve three purposes. First, it'll be a comprehensive planning document for hazardous waste management in California. Second, it'll be a source of information for state and local hazardous waste management efforts. And third, it'll be a guide for DTSC's hazardous waste management program. Next slide, please. The plan is to be presented to the Board of Environmental Safety for review and approval. And once approved, DTSC will implement the plan across all programs, including site mitigation and the environmental chemistry lab. A hazardous waste management plan will be produced every 3 years. It's an iterative process, and planning will be an ongoing effort, and the first plan will not address all hazardous waste management issues. As such, continuous stakeholder engagement is essential throughout the process as well. Next slide, please. The plan will include looking for more ways to address environmental health inequities, updated waste classification criteria, strategies for waste reduction, and capacity planning. As we continue to partner with a wide range of interested parties and consider the feedback received from the public, we are working to align public feedback themes with our main themes centered around these 4 focus areas. Next slide, please. So the first focus area of the plan is environmental justice. Next slide, please. Environmental justice is a central consideration in the development of the plan, as it can help inform how we support impacted communities. Planning will incorporate an environmental justice perspective to prevent harm by properly managing hazardous waste and to protect the most vulnerable and environmentally burdened communities. Next slide. So some of the goals and actions we're working towards in the plan include developing recommendations and identifying strategies that lead to a reduction of environmental or health impacts and reduce the management burden of the most vulnerable communities, utilizing and encouraging current environmental justice initiatives such as C3, the Community Considerate Cleanups Initiative, which we'll hear more about later in this presentation. Also, by providing continuous education and workshops such as today, one-on-one meetings with stakeholders or future subject-specific workshops, by making tools and resources available to the public on our website, and using ongoing outreach efforts to collect information about concerns regarding hazardous waste management and gathering potential approaches to address concerns. And throughout the workshop today, we will point out other focus area goals and actions that include environmental justice as well. Next slide. So with that said, we'll open up to questions or comments about what's been presented so far. Do we have any questions in the Q&A or in the chat?
So
No, I
far,
don't see it.
please.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, like I said earlier, we will have more opportunities for feedback throughout the entire workshop. So you can definitely, you'll have time to ask questions at that time as well. All right. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Ludna Durrani.
Thank you,
have
Felice.
one raised hand.
Okay.
One. Let me unmute them.
So we've asked Carly Bramhill to go ahead and I've asked you to unmute. I think you can go ahead and talk now if you wouldn't mind. Okay, we're going to go ahead and I guess come back to Ms. Bramhill, and hopefully we can hear you shortly here. And then in the meantime, we've got a couple of Q&A questions. We're asking to go back to slide 19, please. And did you have a question about slide 19, or did you just want to take a look at it? Anonymous attendee, you can go ahead and reply in the chat if you'd like. Okay, I'm not hearing back, so we're gonna go ahead and leave that open for a couple seconds. And then we have another question coming from a guest. I'm looking forward to hearing more about the EJ portion of the plan. Does DTSC have an idea as to how it will prioritize communities based on EJ scoring or classification?
I'll take that one, and then Felice touch up on it if you need to. Eric, thanks for the question. I think that's going to potentially vary depending upon what subject or program is utilizing EJ information to help inform for various decision making. And some of that's going on right now. I know enforcement is utilizing various metrics from Cal Enviro Screen, disadvantaged communities, DACs that are also being considered in various areas around the department. So we're taking a look at EJ for specific programs and looking at how the best recommendations we can utilize, I guess, for each of those separate programs. And there's a number of them already going on, like I mentioned before.
Thanks, Ryan. Do we have any other questions? It looks like the guest that did have their hand raised no longer does, so we might have lost that person. So if you'd like to come back and raise your hand again. We have another guest. I'm going to go ahead and Julie Korenstein, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead and speak when convenient for you.
I tried to put the question in the chat, but for some reason I can't get it to open up. This is the first time I've actually listened to what you're presenting. And I don't know if you are more specific. I have not read the report, but my concern is the Santa Susana Field Lab, which is, they have done the cleanup of multiple different types of hazardous waste and where those materials will be taken to. Do you cover that at all?
Hi, Julie. Thank you for the question. We don't specifically talk about Santa Susana Field Lab in the report itself. We were looking at waste streams as they're generated, kind of as on a broader scale. So we've utilized a few different databases to collect information from related to hazardous waste generation. One in particular was the hazardous waste tracking system, which is where the manifested hazardous waste information lives. So we pulled data from that and a number of other databases to put together the first report. If you have specific questions about Santa Susana or specific comments, we recommend you contact the project team directly, as they are closest to that project and have the most up-to-date information.
Okay, but you're discussing or will be discussing or have discussed different hazardous material sites in California. Isn't that what your research is on?
This first report is looking at it more broadly and looking for how, in planning, to make recommendations for programs or in DTSC and using the plan as a guidance document for decision making.
I guess my concern is that it's so generalized, and for me, I need more specific information, and otherwise it's kind of meaningless. It doesn't have, any information that is really helpful to our particular situation, because if there's no discussion on the Santa Susana Field Lab cleanup, which is happening right now, and what recommendations are, where should some of the material are nuclides, another type of toxic chemicals. And so you're not discussing any specific transporting of or where to go. It's just a general document. I don't quite understand.
Maybe I can talk a little bit about the report and what we talked about in section 2 and 3.
Yeah.
A little bit. So thank you for attending and learning a little bit about our projects. We released a report last year that talked a little bit, particularly in section 2 and 3 of hazardous waste generation, on manifests and non-manifested waste, where in which we are talking about different waste streams like soil contamination that was being shipped between 2010 and 2021. That was majority of how we showed how waste was being generated and then being transported to destination facilities. Those could be hazardous waste landfills in California or outside of California. We did not focus on a very specific cleanup or future cleanups. That may be something we look at a little bit more in future iterations, but that isn't something we released in the report. Yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and in addition, section 4 does discuss the areas surrounding various destination facilities. And the report and plan are being generated based upon the requirements of Health and Safety Code 25135. So we have some fairly specific statutory requirements for the types of information that we're required to include.
Does the report specify where the different sites are, and what type of materials can be dumped there?
It does to a certain level of detail. We talk about the permitted hazardous waste facilities and do an analysis of those. In addition, there's information about various types of universal waste handlers or collectors. One piece of information that we are working to gather more information about is hazardous waste generators. In section 2, you will read that there's about 100,000 hazardous waste generators in California. And looking into those and where those are located and the different types of hazardous waste generators are pieces of information that we're continuing to gather to help inform for various pieces of the planning project that we're working on now.
Does your report make recommendations about how where a hazardous waste site is in relationship to where people live and how far away it has to be?
No, it does not make specific statements or recommendations about that in particular.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Julie.
It looks like we have no more questions or comments from what I can tell, Ryan.
Okay. Why don't we go on and we'll hand it over to Lubna.
Yeah,
Let's go to the next slide.
yeah, next slide, please.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Lubna Durrani, and I'm the senior scientist for this program. And today I'll be talking about evaluation of the waste criteria. As one of the important focused area is to evaluate the existing hazardous waste criteria with a lens of continuous process improvement. Next slide, please. To do this evaluation, here are these 3 main components that we are looking at. The first component is comparative analysis of existing waste criteria of state versus federal, along with the evaluation of their safeguards. Second one is the evaluation of existing test methods to ensure that they are up to date with the advancements of current science and technology. And thirdly, we are also exploring the contaminants of emerging concern as a potential of possible waste streams for the future endeavors. In order to do this well, we have to have a full understanding of what the criteria are. As a reminder, we had covered hazardous waste identification criteria in detail in one of our previous workshops conducted last year. So if you want to know more details about waste criteria, this is highly recommended to refer to the workshop which is available at our website. Next slide, please. Before we go further, it is important to understand how we got here. California was first in the nation to establish the hazardous waste control laws in 1972, which means we were 4 years ahead to the federal. As Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, called RCRA, came in 1976. Even though California was in front, it is best to note that RCRA is overarching, and California is under its authority. California, being an authorized state, may have laws and regulations that go beyond the federal. For example, California is broader in scope and is more stringent than federal, which means we may identify more as hazardous waste than the federal system would. Wastes that would be identified as hazardous under the federal criteria are known as RCRA hazardous waste, and those that are hazardous in California but not by federal are called non-RCRA. Please note that later, when we discuss how we are reviewing our criteria, it is really for non-RCRA ones. So, our history of hazardous waste management is from 70s. Fast forward to now, we are revisiting these criteria that have been around for many decades. And these hazardous waste control laws from that era implemented the same criteria that we are still employing today. In 2021, per Senate Bill 158, the Health and Safety Code 25135 gives DTSC the authority through which we are going to evaluate the existing hazardous waste identification criteria. During the past 40 years, things have changed, and advancements in science and technology may indicate the need for changes in criteria. For example, updated analytical testing methods, modified drinking water standards, and modified modern landfills, which means improved groundwater protection. On the other hand, these advancements may cause more challenges, like additional waste streams from emerging contaminants. Speaking about waste criteria evaluation, it is important to understand what the existing hazardous waste identification criteria are. Next slide, please. So, as we discussed in the report, at a surface level explanation of the criteria is that it is a process of identification of hazardous waste through a fairly complex established criteria. In general, this process is completed by answering a number of questions. Is this a waste? Is it a hazardous waste? For a waste to be hazardous waste, there are two ways that can happen. Either the waste can be on a list of hazardous waste, or if the waste exhibit a characteristic of a hazardous waste. We are going to talk about listing and characteristics more on the next slide. But before we get to that, we also consider if it is excluded or exempted from regulations. Now, for exclusions and exemptions, this is to share that federal hazardous waste criteria have several exclusions and exemptions which may not necessarily be adopted by state of California. For instance, federal identifies 44 exclusions, but California only adopted 8 exclusions into its regulations. Let's see how federal and California goes by this identification criteria. Next slide, please. The hazardous waste identification criteria are used to identify which wastes are hazardous. And again, as a refresher, let's see how the hazardous waste is further categorized based off its identification criteria. If a waste is identified hazardous based on listing, then that hazardous waste is known as listed waste. You can see to the left of this slide. Or if it is identified based off its characteristics, then that hazardous waste is known as characteristic hazardous waste, which is to the right of this slide. And as I mentioned earlier, the criteria are based on fairly complex process to identify as the waste is listed or if the waste is exhibiting a characteristic. Listed wastes are the ones that are already identified on a list established by the federal program. The characteristic hazardous wastes are those that are identified by their properties that make them hazardous when improperly managed. Let's discuss this identification criteria briefly. Next slide, please. All right, let's talk about listed waste first. There are 4 federally established listings with letters F, K, P, U. However, in California, we have an additional fifth listing represented as letter M here. Keep in mind that the letters only provide the name for the list and don't have any other significance. However, they represent specific categories. For instance, the F listing is for waste that come from a broader swath of industries. These include, for example, several kinds of spent solvents that are dangerous because they are toxic, ignitable, or both. The K listing is for industry specific waste, for example, from the wood preservation industry. And the two lists, P and U, are for hazardous chemicals that have not been used or but they are still being rejected, either because they got expired or off specification, or are the residues remaining in containers or have been spilled into the environment. The main difference between these two lists is that P listing is for the chemicals that are more dangerous than normal hazardous waste. Now, talking about the fifth listing, M, which is California specific listing only, as in 2003, California adopted a separate hazardous waste listing in addition to the RCRA listed hazardous waste for mercury containing products. The examples are mercury switches and mercury containing lamps. Now, let's talk about characteristics. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, the characteristic hazardous wastes are those that are identified by their properties that make them hazardous when improperly managed. Waste can be determined to exhibit a hazardous waste characteristic through either applying knowledge of the hazardous characteristic in light of the materials or the processes used or by laboratory analysis. There are four main characteristics for both federal and state. Those are ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. For example, ignitability is for the ones that can catch fire, such as organic solvents used in painting or cleaning parts, etc. Similarly, corrosivity is for wastes that have an extreme high or low pH or corrode steel at a certain rate. Examples can be strong acids, alkaline degreasers, etc. Reactivity is for the materials that tend to be unstable at normal temperatures and pressures, or they can be explosives too, such as cyanide waste, sulfide waste, or peroxide. And toxicity is for chemicals that are poisonous or can cause cancer, such as toxic metals. Now, both federal and state use the same four characteristics, but California differs substantially within these. For example, the corrosivity and toxicity criteria are different in California than federal. And the most differences are found in toxicity criteria. The federal system has one criterion used to identify waste as toxic, while California uses the federal toxicity criterion and 8 additional criteria. These significant differences resulted the identification of more waste as hazardous in California than in the federal hazardous waste program. Next slide, please. Let's see how. So this is the example, and we are using toxicity characteristic as an example for identification criteria. As I mentioned earlier, the federal toxicity characteristic has just one criterion shown here in green circle. This is called TCLIP, which stands for Toxicity Characteristics Leaching Procedure. TCLIP is based on the toxic compound concentrations that would become soluble in a simulated landfill situation. Those kind of toxins can leach down through the landfill and contaminate groundwater. Now, California has TCLIP for toxicity and eight additional criteria, including its own version of a simulated landfill test called WET, which stands for Waste Extraction Test. Also, a total composition analysis and 4 criteria based on whether the waste is lethal to animals, including acute oral, dermal, inhalation, and aquatic toxicities, in addition to a list of cancer-causing chemicals and a department imposed criterion. Because California has many more criteria for toxicity than the federal standards, so we identify more waste as non-RCRA hazardous waste due to characteristics of toxicity than the other three characteristics. Another thing to mention here is California also regulates 9 additional metals such as copper, cobalt, nickel, zinc, etc., which are not federally regulated. The underlying research that provided the rationale to regulate these additional metals is from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 1980s. So these factors will be reviewed to determine if more recent information is available. Now, getting familiar with the toxicity criteria, let's take these two toxicity tests called federal T-CLIP and California WET as an example to see how they are different from each other. Next slide, please. This is an example of comparing federal toxicity test T-CLIP with California toxicity test WET. Both T-CLIP and WET use laboratory simulations to predict how the waste will contribute to the composition of leachate in a landfill setting. For example, the concentrations of toxic metals. Now, this comparison between these two tests show how they are different from each other when it comes to use acids, extractions, dilutions, and number of constituents. Overall, California WET is more stringent than federal T-CLIP. For instance, federal test uses acetic acid versus California test uses citric acid, which is a buffering chemical that tends to extract more metals. Also, California test has a longer extraction period and it dilutes the waste less than the federal test does. So, all these things cause the WET to capture more waste than T-CLIP, which means California identifies more non-RCRA waste as compared to RCRA. Next slide, please. In planning, we are utilizing the information that we just discussed in our report to help inform for our hazardous waste criteria planning efforts. For this, we split these focused areas into two categories. One is how hazardous wastes are identified, and two is how hazardous wastes are managed. Next slide, please. We are conducting our evaluation and we will provide recommendations to ensure identification criteria are robust, reflective of current science, and are protective of public health and the environment. Here are the aspects of our criteria that are under our evaluation first. And all these areas demand an extensive and ongoing research. The main ones are comparing California's criteria with federal standards to find which of our criteria need to be updated. We did an exhaustive comparison in 2023 report, and now we are beginning the process to update the regulations. An example to this evaluation is ignitability characteristic test method for liquid waste, and I'm going to discuss about this in detail later. Now, the next aspect is the review of non-RCRA metals. For instance, looking into their toxicity levels and how they behave in soil. Then, aquatic toxicity test, which is also called fish bioassay or fish test. We are in the beginning stages of evaluating potential alternatives for aquatic toxicity test, as we are required to do so by Assembly Bill 1793 of 2022. Then waste extraction test called WET. We are in the early phase of evaluating this test method along with their rationale and the established concentrations of toxic metals. A reminder, WET is a California specific toxicity test only. Also, the soluble threshold limit concentrations called STLC. These are the concentration levels of toxic metals which were established based off drinking water standards at that time, which means in 70s and 80s. SDLC is under thorough review like WET and is also in the beginning phase of evaluation. One thing to mention here is that all of the criteria were established decades ago, and for the most part, haven't been amended substantially. So, this is extremely important to revisit this criteria for improvement, to keep the criteria up to date with the current methods and scientific advancements, so that maximum protection to the people and the environment is being ensured. As I mentioned earlier, our existing criteria is old and established several decades ago, so there is ongoing research with a continuous evaluation. Next slide, please. One area that we made progress is in the ignitability test methods while comparing test methods of California versus federal. Most wastes that are classified as ignitable are liquors, and for those, the ignitability determination is through measuring their flash point. Little bit of background is that all the testing methods are standardized and there are different test methods, and California adopts certain approved test methods for use by our regulations. These methods are typically approved or standardized by the ASTM, which stands for American Society for Testing and Materials. Our existing criteria includes ASTM standards that were developed in the 70s and 80s, just like federal did at that time. However, gradually US EPA updated some of the modified test methods, but California hasn't updated them yet. So, in California, for flashpoint measurement for liquid waste, the multiple ASTM standards are allowed, which can be seen in brown boxes here. So the brown are the ones which are the three old test methods that California is currently requiring for ignitability determination. One way to see how old they are is to look at the last two digits at the end of these test methods. These two last digits represent the year of their publication. For instance, the first test method in the brown box is ASTM D9379, which means it was published in 1979. And the last one in the brown box is ASTM D3278 78, which now you know is from 1978. Now coming to these two big blue boxes to the right, these are the two new test methods from 2018, as you can see from last two digits there. And EPA had adopted these two additional standards in July 2020 into federal ignitability criteria. So, federal existing regulations list all these 5 test methods, while California has only 3, which are the old ones. So, in a nutshell, the existing situation is that federal has an option of 5 test methods, including the 3 old plus 2 new test methods, while California is still having the 3 test methods from 1970s, which means these 2 test methods, which are in blue, haven't been updated in California yet. Next slide, please. It is important to understand what are the main differences between the old test methods and the new ones. These are the pictures of the instruments used for flash point determination for ignitability. So to the left is the older version, and the new version is to the right. And the main difference between the two is the use of modified instruments. Let's see a closer look into these. Next slide, please. So what is changed in the new test method is the modification of instruments like thermometers that don't use mercury. And these new thermometers are digital or electronics. Because California still requires the old test methods, labs in California juggle the use of both old and new instruments to be in compliance with both state and federal testing methods. This means labs also have to maintain accreditation based on old and new test methods. The federal criteria's modification was aimed to reduce the use of mercury to support environmental protection and ease the workload for labs by making lab accreditation simpler. Next slide, please. DTAC recommends that, like federal, the two new test methods are adopted into California's program so that California will retain the old standards and will modify the criteria to include the two additional test methods, which are more recent and robust standards. We have just shown that modifications these two tests offer electronics or digital thermometers with no more use of mercury. The update to these methods will streamline processes and keep our practices up to date with current science. Now, after talking about how hazardous waste is being identified, let's discuss the second part, where Ryan Dominguez will discuss how hazardous waste is being managed. Over to you, Ryan. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Lubna. DTSC is required by the Health and Safety Code to make recommendations for potential alternative management requirements for non-RCRA hazardous waste in the planning process. Alternative management standards are regulatory and statutory requirements that are developed in lieu of full requirements for hazardous waste. Now, in summary, alternative management standards may allow for different storage requirements, extend accumulation periods, and allow for disposal at specific non-hazardous waste landfills for some wastes while remaining protective. One example of a hazardous waste that currently utilizes alternative management standards is treated wood waste. Now, treated wood is wood that has gone through a treatment process with chemical preservatives to protect it against pests and environmental conditions. The preservatives often contain constituents like arsenic or chromium or copper and others. Now, treated wood waste has the potential to be a hazardous waste if it contains elevated levels of one or more of the constituents that I just mentioned. If treated wood waste is not managed appropriately or properly, the chemicals it contains can contaminate soil, surface water, and groundwater. Treated wood waste may exceed California hazardous waste thresholds for non-RCRA waste. The alternative management standards simplify and facilitate protective and economical disposal of treated wood waste. Now, one consideration for alternative management is disposal in non-hazardous waste landfills. In order to determine if disposal in these landfills is protective for additional waste, we began reviewing the current design and construction of some non-hazardous waste landfills in California. Next slide, please. Now, as Lubna mentioned, the hazardous waste criteria were developed in the late 70s to late 80s. Now, industrial wastes at the time were being co-disposed with municipal waste at landfills without liners. Now, we determined that we needed to gain a better understanding of the current construction status of the various types of landfills in California to adequately determine if other wastes may be appropriate to recommend for alternative management. Now, we started our review with landfills that accept treated wood waste conditionally upon compliance with all of the applicable regulatory and statutory requirements. The best location of technical information for these landfills is in the documents called joint technical documents. These documents include information about each facility, the waste they accept, facility siting information, design and construction standards, operation information, and other controls like leachate management. Through this review, we've noted that there are a significant number of landfills with cells that have at least a single composite liner with leachate collection. A composite liner is a liner system that utilizes both a plastic liner, and a clay or geosynthetic clay liner to prevent migration of leachate. This has led us to conclude that landfill construction and operation has become significantly more protective over time and has operational controls. Next slide, please. Thanks, Ken. The landfills shown on this map are ones that we are reviewing. As I mentioned before, these are also the landfills that currently accept treated wood waste. Now, moving forward, we'll continue to review the construction and operations of these landfills in consideration for waste streams that may be appropriate for alternative management. Next slide, please. And with that, I will open it back up for questions and comments on this topic.
Hey, Ryan, it looks like we have a couple of comments here. First, we have, well, it's a statement that we have in the chat, and you just might want to address it. It says, the comments made about the hazardous, or I'm sorry, the comments made about where hazardous waste from cleanups go, where facilities are sited, how our California wastes are managed, are where we need to start as we develop the plan from this report. Did you capture those comments?
Thank you. I just saw that, and thank you, Cynthia. Yes, I did capture Julie's comments, and as I was understanding her question, she was asking if we looked at that in reporting, and we did not look at specific facilities. What we are doing is evaluating facilities, and landfills in particular, as I was just talking about, in planning. And so to address your statement that we need to understand, or just a good starting point about where facilities are sited, where waste goes, how California wastes are managed, is a planning question that we're doing the background information and gathering for right now. We haven't had a deep understanding of the non-hazardous waste landfills, or just the other landfills that accept some waste for, like, the treated wood waste. So we had to do a deeper dive and dig up information for that to help inform for those discussions.
Okay, we also have a hand raised from Karen Loricella. Karen Loricella, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. You should be unmuted now. You can go ahead and ask your question when you'd like.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me now.
You can, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Is there any other waste that you look at besides the treated wood waste for the landfill situation?
Sure. The treated wood waste is already allowed, or is already provided alternative management. So we were just looking at the landfills that waste is allowed to go to currently, as our starting point. We haven't dug into specific non-RCRA wastes. So the statute requires us to look at non-RCRA wastes, and we will be going through to evaluate various waste streams. But we haven't identified those yet.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and next we have Michael Caprio. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you when you're ready to speak. Please go ahead and ask your question or make your comment, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for holding the workshop. Just a question, if you have a sense of the timeline for development of the alternative management standards, and which wastes might be subject to those standards, and then would that timeline be different than actual changing of California hazardous waste criteria and thresholds, as well as all the other criteria we've spoken about here so far in the workshop?
Sure. I don't have a good sense of the timing currently. We're looking at doing a more in-depth kind of dive into this issue in particular over the next few months. We are also planning to have some more additional workshops over the summer. I'd hazard a guess that this will be one of the topics that we would be presenting at that time. I don't know if we'll have specific waste streams identified for that at that time, but the timing right now is something that we are working to develop. So sorry, I don't have more information for you on that, Mike.
That's fine, Ryan. And is it plausible that some of this would be ultimately proposed as part of the hazardous waste management plan that's put out in the spring of next year?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable assumption or guess.
At least when it comes to recommendations.
Yeah, at least when it comes to recommendations.
Okay. Yeah, I've spoke with you on the topic before, Ryan and others, and just some of the host communities that we've had discussions with a really high level about this topic and the potential for alternative management standards and or material that's been hazardous for decades being allowed into their communities.
Sure.
In order for us to sort of stand with you and stand behind what is being proposed. I just think, as you know, a pretty robust review on all things testing, all health assessment and health risk assessments, and groundwater geologic air quality issues have to be addressed. So I would just throw that out at you so we can be able to support what's maybe is being suggested.
Right. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, and next we have a question from Eric Nolan. Regarding the ignitability testing methods, why would California retain the old ASTM methods if the newer methods are more robust and reduce mercury use? By retaining the old methods, will California allow generators to select methods that are more favorable to their waste classification? This question could apply to the other waste classifications other than ignitability.
Thanks, Eric, for the question. This is very important question. In 2020, when US EPA adopted the new test methods, they still listed the old test methods because the intent was to give the transition period, number one. Number two is to have more flexibility for the generators. So we are taking the same intent, and it's going to be allowing a transition period. And with the passage of time, maybe it's going to be that just the new test methods will be there and the old test methods will be go away. But right now, we are just taking the same opportunity like federal did, and we are going to keep and retain the old test methods, and we are going to introduce or include the new test methods. I hope I answer your question.
Also the,
Do you want a mic?
And you can introduce yourself also. Okay. Hi, my name is Diana Peebler, and I'm the Environmental Program Manager over this branch, of which the Hazardous Waste Management Plan Unit is one of the units in the branch. In terms of the second part of your question, Eric, about would retaining the old methods allow California generators to select methods that are more favorable? The new federal test method, whether or not they use the new test method or the old test method, it's still a set of flash closed cup tester or another type of machine, but it wouldn't give you a different result. Whether or not you're using the old method or the new method, the flash point would remain the same for the test that's being done, so it wouldn't matter. Thank you. And the second part, the question could apply to other waste classification other than ignitability. Ignitability is the first criteria where we're looking at updated methods, that EPA has updated methods. As this process goes on, we are going to be looking at the other criteria, whether that be corrosivity, reactivity, of which there are no test methods for reactivity. But if there are other test methods that EPA has upgraded and California has not yet adopted them, then we will be looking to adopt the new test methods that EPA has into our regs. Thank you. Thank you, Diana.
I have one hand up, Julie Grandson. Do you want to go to her?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. I'm asking her to unmute.
Yeah.
There you go.
I know I was asking very specific questions before, and I realize that I need to have my questions be more general, but I'm trying to understand your report. I'm assuming it's supposed to be your recommendations, but if it is too general, it's basically meaningless. The questions that I have, and I don't think you're going to be able to answer them. I just don't know exactly who deals with it in terms of hazardous waste sites and the impact on groundwater and drinking water. Again, I just don't understand what your recommendations are about. And also, I'd mentioned before the proximity of these sites to homes and where families live and children and babies and so forth. You don't get into the specifics. It's just other than wood. I mean, I'm sorry. Because maybe this is the first time I have listened to you, that I'm having kind of a difficult time understanding.
Okay. I'll try and give a general overview, and it might be best for us. We'd be happy to take a call offline to walk through any specific or kind of these general types of questions. But the report was focused on gathering. It was a data dump. It was not intended to have recommendations. The report itself is meant to help inform for planning discussions and purposes. As far as this hazardous waste facilities, broadly speaking, there's a number of different types. You have your hazardous waste management facilities and then some contaminated sites. And I'm not sure if you're distinguishing between the two or not, but when it comes to hazardous waste management facilities, they typically function under some kind of permitting process. In California, there's a 5-tier permitting system. The top 2 tiers are what we typically refer to as the hazardous waste management facilities or permitted facilities. And as far as the landfills go for those, there's 2 open hazardous waste management or hazardous waste landfills in the state. These landfills are designed to isolate waste from the surrounding environment and manage it appropriately. They have liner systems, leachate collection, groundwater monitoring, and additional monitoring that goes on to help ensure that groundwater is protected. And the design requirements come from the regulations that are implemented through RCRA.
Who does the monitoring of the sites, and how is it regulated?
There are a number of different entities that provide oversight of monitoring. So a landfill will have a subcontractor typically will come in and provide the groundwater monitoring services. So they'll go in and collect the groundwater. They will then collect samples. Those samples will be sent to a lab, and those labs will provide the analytical analysis required. And the analytical analyses are following the analytical methods, as Lubna was talking about one example. That data will then be submitted to the various departments that provide oversight. So at like a Buttonwillow or a Kettleman, for example, the groundwater monitoring data are provided to DTSC and the Water Board. So it's those 2 entities are monitoring that.
Who requests it? I mean, is it the landfill that asks DTSC to come out, or how does that happen?
I'm not sure I'm understanding.
Why are they submitting the reports?
Why are they submitting the reports?
No, who requests that someone come out and test the water? Is that something that's just done every year, every so many months? I mean,
okay, yeah. So typically it can be quarterly monitoring or annual, or it depends on what the requirement is based upon the type of facility. So it is in the regulations that a groundwater monitoring program is in place for various types of facilities. So they are requirements, regulatory requirements.
We recently had 2 issues with 2 landfills not far from where I live, Sunshine Canyon and the Chiquita landfill, and there's major issues with them. Again, I'm giving you specifics, and I know this is much more generalized, your report.
Yeah,
I'm just
and
wondering what happened and how that happened and who monitored it and so forth.
sure. So Julie, the best thing I think I can recommend to try and answer your questions are if you were to go ahead and contact us at our email address, and we can try and point you in the best direction to answer those types of specific questions. The 2 landfills that you mentioned they're non-hazardous waste landfills, so they're not under our department.
Yeah.
And so it
All right, thank you.
So yeah, please, that's the best way I think we can dive into those.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you, Julie. We have in the Q&A, Ryan, how many landfills accept TWW, and are more landfills going to be approved to accept
Sure.
TWW?
My understanding is I think we're estimating there's about 59 or 60 currently that accept treated wood waste. I don't know if any additional ones are going to be approved to accept it. I don't have that information.
Okay.
But they are located all over the state.
That's a water board and Cal Recycle.
Yeah, and that's a water board and Cal Recycle provide primary oversight.
Okay. Next, we have Carrie O'Keefer. Are you going? Wait a minute. Removed. Are you going to address the different test methods that are required to characterize the waste as hazardous? If not, how can we get that information?
There's numerous test methods that were in Title 22, and we will be reviewing the test methods that need updating.
Yes. Yes, Ryan. As Ryan said, there are several test methods that needs update, and we are going to be reviewing them one by one. And definitely, if there is room for improvement, we will definitely recommend that, and we will address them after a thorough research. And we do coordinate with other units too, especially with the chemistry lab, so that we should have subject matter experts' opinion on that too.
Yeah, and we're working with another unit in our branch as well, the Waste Evaluation and Recycling Unit, to do these analyses and coordination with them.
Correct.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Now we have Michael Thompson. How will we know if treated wood waste ever penetrates past the single or double composite liners at the facilities that accept that type of waste?
Looks like it might be a 2-part question as well. So I'll read the second one also. So that was the first one. And then what I'm actually wondering is if the wood waste initially appears safe to dispose of at facilities, but as the material later deteriorates, the chemicals compromise the liners. Michael, there are groundwater monitoring requirements to monitor for any potential releases. There's leachate collection systems in place. And leachate is, for those unfamiliar with landfills, leachate is the liquid that collects at the bottom of the landfill. Some waste, the water comes from the waste themselves, especially with organic waste. So things in like a municipal landfill, like our trash. It also comes from rainwater that hits the top of the landfill and then infiltrates down and reaches the bottom of the landfill. That liquid is pumped out by the leachate collection systems. You have groundwater monitoring programs as the regulations require. So those systems themselves provide a means of collection as well as monitoring as a form of redundant protections.
Okay. Now we have, Jan also has two in here. Are you going to discuss the waste that is transported out of state and the safeties around that? And another one about how the wood is treated.
How are treated wood determined to be at a level to add to a non-hazardous waste landfill? Okay, so two questions. The first one, we're briefly discussing the transportation out of state today, and I think we're mentioning it.
Very briefly when it comes to the capacity
Yeah.
section. So stay tuned.
Yeah, but we don't have a deep focus on that in this workshop. And then how are treated wood determined to be at a level to add to non-hazardous waste landfill? Treated wood waste, so treated wood that is identified as hazardous in California, that is the category of waste that has been identified for alternative management standards.
We have Maggie Johnson, also no continuation. This one goes specifically to Mike Caprio question. What waste streams is DTSC considering for alternative management standards? E-waste, lithium batteries,
Yeah,
waste.
I got it. Thanks, Elsa. Yeah, what waste streams are we considering for alternative management standards? Is e-waste, lithium battery containing waste, solar panels was part of Maggie's questions. We haven't identified specific waste streams just yet. That's something we're working on.
I don't do that much. I'll just add on though that we will be talking about what you mentioned there, the solar panels, lithium-ion batteries later on. So maybe that might answer some of your questions later on. But we haven't narrowed down the exact ones just yet, but we'll talk about those slightly.
Hey, Anonymous, I hope we can get back on track to the actual plan, which is what the seminar today was all about. Thank you. And that was just a comment. Thank you for explaining your answer to my question the way that you did, since I have no expertise in this area. You explained it in a way that even I could comprehend. Thank you, Michael. Also, thank you from Maggie Johnson. Then we have Eric Nolan again. More of a comment. We need a much better understanding of the generation end of the process. The public needs more transparency on where waste are generated. TRI is a good resource, but I think DTSC needs to provide even more access to the public regarding generators. Additionally, we will always have environmental issues with transportation, treatment, and disposal until we address the generation of hazardous waste. I do not propose reducing generation by relaxing standards. In fact, I am in favor of stricter standards, and we need to incentivize circular, sustainable processes through both regulation and tax benefits. I hope to see strong sustainability incentives in the hazardous waste plan. And that was the last comment.
Okay. I'll just touch on that real quick. Thank you, Eric. And I think we'll move on after because we're a little behind today. But Eric, Stay tuned for some additional generator information. That was an area that we identified in the report as needing additional information. And so we're working to gather that. As you'll see, we're breaking it down into some particular specific waste streams. So we're working to gather additional information on generators because we agree we need more information on it.
Thank you,
Okay.
Ryan.
Yeah, let's go ahead and move forward. Thank you, everybody, for the comments.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kayla Cool. I'm an engineer for the Hazardous Waste Management Plan Unit, and I'm going to be talking about waste reduction. So when we're going to be discussing waste reduction, we mean everything on the pollution prevention hierarchy, including not only source reduction, but also reuse, recycling, and treatment. Some source reduction is important, but not all hazardous waste can be reduced at the source. For example, lithium-ion batteries from electric cars and photovoltaic modules from solar panels are examples of two waste streams that are actually expected to increase in the coming years because they're important to help California reach its other environmental goals. Reducing the waste that needs to be disposed of in hazardous waste management facilities will help reduce the burden on our limited capacity. A circular economy is the best way to manage waste that can't be reduced at the source, which we're going to be talking more about later. As we're going to show in more detail in a later slide, manifested hazardous waste has actually decreased since the year 2000. So our goal is really to help foster this reduction that is already ongoing. Next slide, please. There are tons of hazardous waste streams generated in California. So we had to decide on criteria to narrow down what might make good focus areas for the first hazardous waste management plan. We can't research every waste stream in the first plan, and research even for these streams will be ongoing. And these criteria, of course, will also be used to guide the waste reduction focus areas for future plans. One of the first criteria considered is the potential community impacts of a hazardous waste stream. For example, RCRA waste is likely more hazardous than non-RCRA waste. So reduction in RCRA waste may reduce the potential risk to a surrounding community more than the reduction in non-RCRA waste. Also, generating facilities located in densely populated areas are more likely to have an impact on those communities than generators located in much more sparsely populated areas. Management capacity was another criteria considered. And this is twofold when we talk about capacity. There's the capacity that's general, and then there's the capacity for waste streams requiring specific treatments. Hazardous waste management capacity is limited, even in the general sense, so the largest waste streams are going to tax that limited capacity. Waste streams requiring specialized treatment, though, are even more difficult to manage because there may only be a few facilities offering the mandated treatment, and those facilities may not be located in California. The third criteria considered was whether the waste stream was increasing or emerging. Industrial waste streams from long existing production processes may have already benefited from decades of source reduction practices that are minimizing the hazardous waste that they generate. So that may not be as easy to further reduce. New waste streams come from processes that maybe have more potential for improvement because they haven't had those chances to improve their efficiency. Also, new waste streams may not have established recycling facilities in state because California has not received any standardized hazardous waste facility permit applications for a new or expanded facility in nearly a decade. Next slide, please. Based on these selection criteria, 3 categories of hazardous waste were chosen for analysis. The first is contaminated soil waste because it's the single largest waste stream generated most years in California. The second is incinerable waste because California does not have any incinerators and there is a national backlog for incinerator capacity. The third is alternative energy waste like lithium-ion batteries from electric cars and photovoltaic modules from solar panels. These alternative energy wastes are expected to grow rapidly in the coming decade. Next slide, please. Even before the publication of the Hazardous Waste Management Report, We received feedback from numerous stakeholders requesting that we investigate contaminated soil generation. And that's not surprising because so much of California's hazardous waste is contaminated soil. This graph is showing the hazardous waste generation for the years between 2010 and 2021 and breaking it down into the top 3 categories and then all other manifested hazardous waste. So contaminated soil is in yellow, and it's consistently the single largest waste stream generated in California. Used oil is in gray, and inorganic solids are in orange. Used oil and inorganic solids kind of switch off, which is the second and which is the third largest waste stream each year. And the blue box on top represents all other manifested hazardous waste combined, besides these 3 largest categories. So as you can see, the 3 top waste streams really do dominate the California generation of hazardous waste. A bit of a note here, the code for contaminated soil waste 611 is titled Contaminated Soil from Site Cleanups. This can be a little bit misleading because contaminated soil can also be generated from things that are maybe more like construction projects. So for example, the largest generator of soil in 2021 was actually a utility upgrade project in San Francisco. In general, you look at this graph, you can see that there's a lot of fluctuation yearly in the amount of contaminated soil generated. This is likely because site cleanups are tied to funding availability, and construction projects are often tied to economic conditions. Next slide, please. To try and understand how much DTSC could theoretically influence soil generation, I've broken down site authority into 3 categories. The first category is projects outside of DTSC's oversight, and these are cleanups or construction projects generating hazardous waste soil not overseen by DTSC. And this does include projects managed by other government agencies, like those overseen by the Water Board, but it also includes all projects overseen by private companies or nonprofits. This can include both cleanups and construction projects. The second category is projects under DTSC's oversight, which are cleanup projects generating contaminated soil overseen by DTSC, but that a third party is funding. And these sites are all found in Envirostore, which is DTSC's project tracking database. These sites are both mandated sites that DTSC comes in with enforcement, or they are voluntary agreements. These include cleanup projects where DTSC is not the only oversight agency. Some sites, especially military sites, may be overseen by DTSC, the Water Board, and the US EPA all at the same time. And the third category is projects managed by DTSC. These are cleanup projects generating contaminated soil, both led and funded by DTSC, because DTSC is unable to identify a viable responsible party. And these are more commonly called orphan sites managed through the Orphan Site Program. So what do these 3 categories mean? DTSC does not have the authority to tell a privately led project or a project overseen by a different government agency that it must use treatment technologies instead of excavation. DTSC has slightly more control over projects that it oversees, but DTSC can only ask that the alternative technologies are evaluated. It can't mandate that they be used. Control is further reduced if DTSC is one of multiple oversight agencies on a project. The most authority is on orphan sites, since those aren't funded by a third party, and those sites may prove very useful as testing sites for alternative technologies. However, even if alternative technologies are tested on orphan sites, that's no guarantee that they'll be successful, and many sites may still end up requiring excavation. Next slide, please. So I defined the 3 categories, and then I applied them to the top 76 sites generating contaminated soil in 2021. 2021 was just as an example year. You could apply this to any year, it may vary. The top 76 sites generated 80% of the contaminated soil by weight in 2021. Over 600 sites generated contaminated soil that year. But looking at the top 80% of that soil really gives us good insight into the overall soil generation picture. And you can tell that those top sites really do dominate the generation. And of course, from a waste reduction perspective, it's reasonable to look at the largest generators of contaminated soil waste. Analyzing these top 76 sites generating contaminated soil in 2021, this graph shows the breakdown by site authority of contaminated soil by weight. 68% of soil generated by these top generators was projects outside of DTSC's oversight, which is the big orange block. 23% were projects under DTSC's oversight, and 9% were projects managed by DTSC in blue. Sorry, and projects under DTSC's oversight are in green. Note that the entire amount of soil generated by orphan sites, that entire 8.7%, is actually just one project, Exide. And as I said, these projects are weighted based on 80% of contaminated soil generated by the top generators, so it's not looking at that last 20%. Next slide, please. There's a few takeaways here. Preliminary data from the year 2021 indicates DTSC directly manages less than 10% of contaminated soil from the orphan site program and provides oversight on an additional 23% of contaminated soil generating projects under DTSC agreements or enforcement. So DTSC does not oversee the generation of roughly 2/3 of the contaminated soil generated in California from this analysis. Treatment of soil is often preferred to excavation, and some contaminants in the soil can be very effectively treated. For example, soil vapor extraction works very well on volatile organic contaminants. However, some contamination is more difficult to treat. A lot of soil generated in California is hazardous due to low concentration of heavy metals such as lead. Some of the lead occurrence is due to deposition of lead from old leaded gasoline vehicles as opposed to releases from industry. Heavy metals are typically more difficult to treat than organic compounds, and therefore excavation is often the preferred cleanup method. Some sites may have cleanup treatment options that are technically feasible, but still not viable. So for example, if you have a project with a very tight timeline for construction, maybe it's a school that you want built, excavation provides a cleanup method that typically occurs in a predictable timeline and has a defined endpoint, while treatment of the soil may take longer and be less predictable. DTSC, of course, does not want to create policies that discourage excavation if those policies discourage cleanups. There would likely be greater potential impacts to a community from not cleaning up a site and leaving contamination in place than using excavation to clean up that site. Next slide, please. So despite being the single largest category of waste stream in California, contaminated soil waste likely does not have a substantial potential for reduction. Reduction should still be pursued and may be achievable on a case-by-case basis depending on site conditions, but we're not likely to see a substantial reduction in the weight of soil generated. A better approach to cleanups, therefore, isn't necessarily to try and reduce contaminated soil generation, but instead to try and minimize impacts to the community in which the cleanup occurs. Next slide, please. As a result of continued feedback from the California Environmental Justice Alliance, CJAC, regarding the Equitable Communities Revitalization Grant, DTSC's Office of Brownfields is piloting the C3 initiative, which stands for Community Considerate Cleanups. This Office of Brownfields has met several times with a diverse group of stakeholders, including environmental consultants, environmental justice advocates, and other industry experts. These meetings have covered a broad range of topics and have served as a platform to explore issues surrounding cleanups from multiple perspectives and work towards developing solutions. The Office of Brownfields will create a C3 quick reference guide for practitioners to use during cleanup planning and implementation, and should have the guide finalized this year. The quick reference guide is being created with voluntary cleanups overseen by DTSC in mind, but the goal is that it will be available for use on any cleanup or any project that will generate hazardous contaminated soil waste. This guide will provide recommendation on ways to adopt the community lens when designing a cleanup and encourages the use of on-site treatment options where appropriate. When excavation is determined to be the most appropriate action, contractors are encouraged to minimize impacts to the community as much as possible. For example, one way to achieve this might be limiting the time that trucks carrying contaminated soil waste may leave the cleanup site to hours outside of school pickup and drop-off times. Sometimes you can make modifications like this that make the cleanup much more acceptable to the surrounding community. Next slide, please. So that was looking at contaminated soil. We're going to switch gears here and now look at incinerable waste. Incinerable wastes are another category of hazardous waste generated in California that we are researching for the plan. Some wastes are required to be treated prior to hazardous waste disposal by the Land Disposal Restriction Program, the LDR program. Treatment renders the waste less harmful to groundwater by reducing the potential for leaching of hazardous constituents and reducing waste toxicity by destroying or removing harmful constituents. Incineration of certain types of hazardous waste is one of the treatment methods required by land disposal restrictions. There are many types of waste that require incineration, such as some types of solvents generated in the chemical and pharmaceutical manufacturing industries, and also the petroleum refining industry. Unlike contaminated soil waste, incinerable waste is actually not that large of a category of hazardous waste generated. Incinerable waste makes up only about 3% by weight of hazardous waste manifested in California. Incinerable waste may be a good target for reduction, though, for several reasons. Even though 81% of California's hazardous waste is non-RCRA and only hazardous in California, about 78% of incinerable waste is RCRA and therefore hazardous federally. So even if that waste goes to other states, it still must be treated in a hazardous waste incinerator. There are no hazardous waste incinerators in California and limited incinerator capacity nationwide. This has resulted in an incinerator backlog that persists to this day. Therefore, reduction in incinerable waste is more important than other types of waste from the perspective that there is limited management capacity. In addition, incinerable waste may benefit from alternative treatment methods where reduction is not possible. For example, supercritical water oxidation, also known as SQO, has been proven effective at treating some incinerable waste. And we know from the feedback that we've received that there's a lot of interest in this technology, and we even visited a facility that demonstrated SQO for us, which was really informative to get to see the technology in person. However, for RCRA incinerable waste, treatment still needs to comply with the approved federal standards. What limitations the federal requirements may pose to innovative alternatives to incineration is an area that we're going to be continuing to research. Next slide, please. To dive into incinerable waste more, this is the incinerable waste generated between 2010 and 2021. As you can see, there don't seem to be any trends regarding generation. The generation seems slightly higher than 10 years ago, but not enough to see a very clearly increasing trend. The generation just seems to go up and down, but mostly stable. Next slide, please. To understand the opportunities for reduction of incinerable waste, you have to first understand the industries that are generating this waste. To try and understand where incinerable waste is being generated, the North American Industry Classification System, NAICS, was used to sort incinerable waste. This graph shows the top 7 NAICS codes for incinerable waste, and all other sectors outside of that top 7 are sorted into the gray colored block. However, the top waste stream in pink is actually waste management and remediation services. And so this represents the management of incinerable waste, not the generation. So unfortunately, this code is obscuring the actual industries that are generating these wastes. The second highest category, besides the one combining everything not in the top 7 streams, with rail transportation services, which is that kind of orangey color. And like the waste management and remediation services, we suspect that rail transportation is not related to the generation of incinerable waste, but that instead it's representing the transportation of incinerable waste. That being said, the other categories in those top 7 do provide more insights into incinerable waste generation. These are chemical manufacturing, petroleum and coal products manufacturing, transportation equipment manufacturing, professional, scientific and technical services, and personal and laundry services. So these are the industries that we're going to be researching to better understand the generation of incinerable waste. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Spencer to talk about alternative energy waste. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kayla. I'm Spencer Everett over here. I'm an environmental scientist within the unit, and I'm going to be tagging in to share some of what the research and stuff work we're doing relating to the alternative energy waste streams. Now, the third category we are examining for waste reduction is alternative energy waste streams. These include lithium-ion batteries from electric vehicles and electronic devices, and photovoltaic modules, which make up solar panels, as you probably know that. California has mandated that all cars sold by 2035 must be electric or plug-in hybrids, and lithium-ion battery-powered electric vehicles are projected to make up a significant number of these vehicles. Similarly, a 2020 law requires that solar panels must be included on all new homes and apartment buildings. Now, these mandates will increase the use of these alternative energy sources, but this will later cause an increase in alternative energy waste when they reach end of life and are discarded. So while source reduction is the most desired method we have to attain waste reduction, given how much these PVs are going to increase in demand and how the lithium-ion battery chemistry may not change soon, these waste streams might be best served by recycling and reuse. So we've been looking into that. Next slide, please. All right, so let's go into more detail on the lithium-ion batteries first. Lithium-ion batteries are alternative energy waste stream with unique concerns that warrant further analysis. One of the defining aspects of lithium-ion batteries is their ignitability and reactivity characteristics that set them apart from other batteries. Now, lithium-ion batteries of all types contain electrolytes that are frequently flammable. And it is imperative that we consider this, ignitability aspect when making assessments for best management practices of this waste stream. Now, within the lens of waste reduction, there are options to consider for managing lithium-ion batteries, such as new opportunities for treatment or even reuse and repurposing. Most notable, we have been following new technology that is showing evidence of increased efficiency in recycling lithium-ion batteries. There is even research on directly reusing or repurposing batteries without treatment that has previously been required to recycle these batteries. We will go into further depth on that aspect in the next slide. But that being said, we talk about recycling, but there are no recycling or treatment facilities devoted to lithium-ion batteries within California at the moment. And only recently are a few starting to be constructed in the United States and gain traction. So this is an observation deemed relevant to the growing demand for lithium-ion batteries that we project to see within the state. Now, lastly, there are different types of lithium-ion batteries that differ on a chemical level. Without going too in depth here, we just want to emphasize that it's another important aspect of the management of these waste streams, and we want to recognize the different makeups of lithium-ion batteries as we go forward with the plant. Now, let's go into the specifics of recycling and treatment available for these batteries. So next slide, please. All right, so we're seeing that current research provides three main options for recycling lithium-ion batteries, which you can see on this slide. At a high level, the first two treatment methods, hydrometallurgical and pyrometallurgical, operate similarly and that they both reclaim valuable metals and separate them from the non-metallic components. The difference between these two lies in how it's accomplished. Hydrometallurgy, we're going to start on the left, uses aqueous solutions to extract the desired metals through leaching. Leaching might be a familiar term. And the pyrometallurgy, on the other hand, uses external heat to recover the valuable metals by melting the desirable ones and burning the non-metallic parts. So hydrometallurgy, think like liquid, and pyrometallurgy, like fire and heat. Both methods have their pros and cons, and we intend to follow the development of both these, technologies. Direct recycling, the one on the right, is a third, and it's a more novel treatment option with some pilot programs currently documenting its potential. Direct recycling attempts to preserve the valuable components of the battery and salvage them in a directly reusable format without the treatment application of heat or chemicals like the prior two we just discussed. Now, this saves energy and reduces the need for manufacturing and environmental costs that accompany the previous two treatment methods. However, it's worth saying that it's new, but it's a potential solution and to the demand of the lithium-ion batteries, and we intend to keep an eye on it. All right, next slide, please. So we talked about the lithium-ion batteries. We also mentioned photovoltaic modules. These are pretty often abbreviated as PVs, you might see on the slide, and they have the potential to be understood more. So to reiterate, California has mandated that all future buildings include solar panels. And so we see that the average lifespan of a PV is about 30 to 35 years. And there are expected to be many more tons of PVs needing to be managed and recycled in the future. And this number will only increase as California strives for sustainability. PVs are a universal waste in California. Lithium-ion batteries mentioned earlier are also a universal waste. And what this means is that there are reduced reporting requirements. These reduced reporting requirements limit the amount of data that we have on the management of these waste streams. So we don't have as much information on PVs or lithium-ion batteries. However, there are still some reporting requirements in the form of an annual report that is filed by mail each year. These forms provide an estimate of the amount of PVs being handled annually and will be instrumental in recognizing this growing waste stream and the success of its management. In fact, data provided from these annual reports inform the hazardous waste report sections on PVs. So please feel free to read that if you want to get the actual graphs and some more in-depth data on those PVs. So these reporting requirements are currently being reviewed because they're very important for us to get an understanding of this waste stream. And our goal is to deduce if the current reporting requirements are sufficient. Next slide, please. So to tie this all together, one of the main goals of waste reduction and use of alternative energy is the development of the circular economy. The circular economy has motivated this analysis of recycling and reuse of alternative energy sources for when they become waste. Lithium-ion batteries and PVs have the potential to be recycled. In recycling these wastes, we are closing the loop of the circular economy, and this provides the sustainability that California is trying to attain. Recognizing this, recycling facilities are an essential part of this process that will be studied as the hazardous waste plan develops within its iterative process. So with that, next slide, please. We're going to open up the questions for relating to waste reduction. Thank you. And any feedback you have.
Okay, so it looks like we have quite a few questions. I'm going to do my best to get to everyone in the order in which we received them, but most of these are in the question and answer. Actually, it looks like all of these are in question and answer now. So we're going to go ahead and start off with Marty Walters. My apologies. You indicated that you can ask this question live, or would you like me to read this out? I'll go ahead and unmute you. Okay, are you unmuted?
Yes, I just got the little thing. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think that maybe this is not the right part of the workshop to ask this question, but I feel like in this section, we're kind of jumping into how to reduce waste. But I think I've commented before that with the way that we do waste ID in California, it's so complicated and so convoluted that, things like how soil is characterized and whether it's really a waste or not, and all those questions, we really need to have better tools for generators, because right now they're really at the mercy of their consultants or their waste management companies. It's very, very hard to, it's hard to double check the way that waste is being characterized. And most generators, don't really have good tools to do it themselves. So they're really reliant on a waste management contractor or a consultant to do that. So my big comment is, before we jump into all this waste reduction and all that stuff, do we have a good strategy for integrating in improved waste ID and characterization methods that's accessible to all the generators?
Okay, I'll touch on that one just briefly. Hi, Marty, and thank you. And that's a topic that we've been talking about a little bit. How can we improve the tools that we currently have available for generators? It's in discussion. We're trying to figure out how to best do that. As you indicated, it is a complicated system, and providing adequate help, the department providing adequate tools or better tools, or improving the ones that are currently available is important. So that's something that we are currently discussing. I don't have any specifics for you, as we're still talking about the best way to do that. But we are
That
working.
sounds good.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it too. And I appreciate all the effort you're going to. I don't want to, I should have said that first, and I apologize. That, you guys are doing a great job. And I really appreciate the deep dive into some of the methodologies and all that stuff. And I think what I'm doing is zooming back out to, the real basics of what is a waste, and is this soil a waste? And I don't think that a lot of people in California can really do a good job of answering that question.
Oh, thanks, Marty.
Okay, and then we have another question from Ambar. Ambar, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Rivera, and it says, are projects outside DTSC's oversight posted on Envirostore? And I can answer that and say that they are not. We only post projects under our oversight on Envirostore.
Yeah, I could just, sorry, I could
please.
just add to that there are a few instances of sites that start out, like DTSC will have the site available and then say, this site was transferred to, a local agency or the water control board. So there are a few that were on Envirostore and then transferred to other agencies and noted as such. But you're right that in general, they are not available on Envirostore.
Thanks for making that clarification. That is a very good point, Kayla. And as you know, that just points out to the sometimes the complexity of some of these projects and how things kind of change and our analysis change. But thank you for pointing that out. Thank you very much. Okay, next we have from Carrie O'Keefe a question that says, I find it odd that California is not going to allow the sale of petroleum-fueled cars within the next 10 years, but we don't even have our own disposal facility. Where are we going to put the batteries? Do you think other states will accept our waste? And then also connected to that from Carrie O'Keefe is, do we have any battery recycling facilities in the works?
Carrie, I think these are great questions. This is why we've highlighted the need to look into this further. We're not aware in our project of any current applications for new battery recycling facilities in California. So to answer that question, not that we're aware of. But I think this is why we've highlighted this area as one of our focus areas for this first plan, because it's very important that we get a better understanding of the waste stream itself and facilities that are required to manage it. And the regulatory and statutory requirements that are currently in place in California's program.
No, not that. I think you nailed it.
Take your thunder. Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're great. Yeah, we're looking at we're trying to see evidence of how that's being done elsewhere, but again, as Ryan stated, not currently in California that we know of, but we are trying to be observant of what's going on in other states and other countries.
Thank you. So now we are going to go back to Ambar Rivera. I think there was a question that was actually connected to the last one as well. So that goes, so does DTSC really not know anything about projects outside their oversight? Is that safe? Are contractors held accountable or making sure soil is safe for humans?
I can start.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, let me go up to the comment. So does not know anything about projects under their oversight? Is that safe? So, Ambar, there's a couple of things in here, I think. One is that another agency may be providing oversight for a facility or for a cleanup project, a cleanup type project, either a local agency or a water board, one of the water board, or state water board, or one of the water boards. In addition, the other types are just general construction projects. So, for example, if there's a company that needs to go and bury some electrical lines, and they're out somewhere where there's naturally occurring like arsenic or asbestos in the ground, they may have to end up managing that as, if they dig a trench, they may have to end up managing that waste as hazardous. We wouldn't be notified that a company is going to go and dig a trench, and may or may not generate a hazardous waste. That's just general construction, and so that's kind of how it goes. That those companies or construction projects are responsible for managing that waste appropriately, so they have to go through the testing in order to adequately manage it. And make sure it ends up in the, if it is disposed of, it makes up, they have to make sure it goes to the right place.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add to that, but as Ryan said, really this is DTSC's oversight kicks in once the waste has been generated and determined to be hazardous, and then it is required to go to an appropriate management facility.
Yeah, there's a kind of two parts, or there's more than two parts of DTSC, but a lot of the overlying conversation that has been had so far today is it gets into this not gray area, but it's this area in between a site cleanup and hazardous waste management. And there are two different considerations. And when you start to get into that center point, they can get complex. And so it's important to remember that site cleanups is one thing, and then hazardous waste management is a very different thing. And so for a site cleanup, one of the interesting observations was a lot of the times you have three types of waste generated: non-hazardous, non-RCRA hazardous waste, and RCRA hazardous waste. And from our observations, a lot of the time, the big chunk of that waste is likely non-hazardous. And then you can also have the next largest chunk is non-RCRA. And then often it's a much smaller chunk is actually RCRA hazardous waste from a site cleanup, depending on obviously the circumstances. But from the observations from the projects that we were looking at a bit, that seemed to be the case often.
Great, thank you, Ryan. And thank you, of course, for the questions. Okay, moving on. From Ivana Castellanos, we have a question. What does DTSC know about the cleanups that it does not have oversight of? What types of projects might these be? So we kind of addressed a little bit of this, but maybe a little bit more elaboration on some other projects that we know about that don't have oversight of.
Sure. So I kind of briefly mentioned it when I was discussing the 2021 top projects, but like another example of project generating contaminated soil was that utility upgrade project in San Francisco, which was the #1 generator of contaminated soil waste in California that year. And this was a utility upgrade. It was not a cleanup project, but they did pilings, and when they tested the soil, it was determined to be hazardous, mostly low concentrations of lead. San Francisco, of course, was built on fill. There may be things like lead-based paint that is included in that fill. So that's another example of a project that is not necessarily a traditional cleanup, but it's just a construction project that ended up generating hazardous soil waste.
Thank you, Kayla. Okay, and we have another question from Edgar Baranda. Have you guys found any cases of cancer in the populations that you guys researched that tie into the contaminated areas that you guys have researched?
Thank you, Edgar. We haven't looked specifically at that question. That is also a question that might be best answered by a separate agency in California, the California Department of Public Health. They may have a lot more information about cases of cancer in different populations.
Okay, and we have another question from Karen Loricella. It happens to be problematic at a long haul from Northern California for Class 1 landfill contaminated soil, with only 2 landfills accepting the waste, Kettleman and Buttonwillow. As an example is such a lower lever, I think it meant say level maybe, I don't know, low
Level.
Okay, 1 ppm for certain pesticides like DDT, DDD, and DDE. Is there any plans to address this since it takes a lot of trucking to get to the landfills? If no one puts in for a landfill permit, then it'll never change.
Thank you, Karen. This, I think, kind of also aligns with the question earlier that we were getting about waste streams for alternative management. Previously, someone asked if we were looking at like solar panels or lithium-ion batteries. There was one other one that they asked about too.
E-waste.
E-waste.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like this would kind of fit into that line of questions. So now we have 4 waste streams for consideration for alternative management that folks have been asking about here. And so I think it would fit into that part of the evaluation, Karen.
Yeah, are there any other questions?
Andrew, there was one that I saw come up through here that I don't know if we addressed. But let me see if I can find it. Maybe we did. Sorry, I mumble sometimes. I think we addressed it actually. Okay.
Well, it's okay because we have another one that just came in.
Perfect.
So, this is from an anonymous attendee. I don't understand how soil that is determined during construction to be contaminated does not then become subject to DTSC oversight. How is this waste tracked? Parentheses, since it is apparently included in DTSC's manifested waste data, close parentheses.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Sorry if I wasn't entirely clear on this. The soil itself that is tested to be a hazardous waste is, as I said, under DTSC's oversight in the sense that it is required to be in the manifested waste data. So all of the soil that I examined, that was manifested hazardous waste soil. So yes, you're absolutely correct that it is in DTSC's manifested waste database, and it is tracked in that way. When I referred to oversight, I was more referring to oversight over the generation of the waste, because DTSC is not the oversight agency for that particular project. Hopefully that explains myself a little bit better.
And I think it also touches on kind of that difference between like a cleanup versus just a waste generation, hazardous waste management that I mentioned earlier. And so I think that's that distinction, where it kind of comes in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and it looks like one more question from Wendy Saavedra. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Wendy, you're ready to speak. Convenient for you. Yeah, we're having some trouble here, it looks like. So, Wendy, if you wouldn't mind sending in your question through the Q&A, we'd be happy to answer that. We're having, it looks like, some problems getting you unmuted.
Oh, question answered.
Okay, and then we have a question from Karen Loricella. The generators are put in place where they can be out of compliance since incinerators out of state are backed up. I've had the waste contractor cancel my packaging and shipping days since the incinerators are backed up. Or the certain waste streams incinerated is the only options. How can this improve? Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. You want to? Yeah, I'll pass it over to Diana.
Thanks, John, for your question. So if a generator is going to exceed their storage limits, their time limits, because their waste is being backed up and they can't get it into an incinerator, and maybe the TSDF in California is also backed up because they can't ship it to one of the incinerators across the country, the generator can apply to the department for what we call an extension to the storage requirement. Recently, we've issued probably over 700 in the last year to generators who need more time to store their waste on site And we recognize, obviously, as the rest of the country does, that there is this incinerator backlog. And so we have been issuing generators an extension to their storage time so that you're not in trouble with your local Coupa agency that's overseeing you. And there is an application online to just apply for that storage extension. And you can call the regulatory assistance officers and they can direct you on how to apply for a storage extension. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. I think that also touches on one other reason why we've flagged this and highlighted this as a central waste stream to focus on currently.
Yeah.
Oh, my mistake. I was muted. Sorry. We have another question. What are the potential short-term and long-term side effects of the hazardous waste that you guys have mentioned? Is it dangerous? Are we talking infections or diseases?
I'm not sure of the specific hazardous waste that they're referring to.
It wouldn't be infections or diseases though, right? That would be like medical waste or biohazardous waste.
I would assume so. But yeah, and it might be, I don't know if we're in a best position to talk about general waste streams or even impacts from specific ones without coming with very specific answers or folks that like a toxicologist. Or
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
So sorry about that.
Yeah. Okay.
And it looks like, oh, we got one more come in here from Bettina Papadeus. Do the alternative technologies to incineration apply to flammable solids, liquids, and poisons? What are some of the implementable methods for source reducing these types of waste?
Flammable solids, liquids, and poisons. I'll take a shot at it, and Diana, if you want to add in anything that I miss. There are some wastes that are allowed to be treated on site. Whether there are technical or the technical part of that is that there are some wastes that technically and just in their ability to be treated on site. Spent solvents, for example, are one. However, that's not always possible, and I'm not familiar enough yet to understand all the ins and outs of that. However, if it is shipped off-site, the incinerable wastes, those are ones, especially the RCRA wastes, they're required to be incinerated. That is the treatment standard that is required. Now, the overarching regulations or statutes that govern how those wastes are managed is something that we are working to better understand and more completely understand, so we can better put our finger on what might be impeding or allowing certain treatments to happen or not in California. California's program is quite different than RCRA in terms of what's allowed for treatment and recycling options.
Okay, and we have one other question from Edgar Baranda. What areas of California are you guys basing this research in? Los Angeles?
The statute that we're implementing doesn't, it's a statewide report and plan.
And then one other question from Mary Wen. Are there any new initiatives on the disposal of empty containers?
I'll take that.
Okay, I'll pass it over to Diana.
Hi, Mary. Thanks for the question. California has an empty container rule that is pretty stringent. Our empty container rule says that a container is empty if it has a liquid and in effect is drip dry. And if the container held a solid, if all of the remaining solid in the container has been practically scraped out. EPA has an empty container rule saying that a container is empty if it still holds 1 inch or less or 3% by volume. Recently, EPA is determining whether or not they want to be more stringent and create a regulation that is more like California's more stringent rule. California did a study in 1989 where we looked at the facilities in California that were cleaning empty containers. And we found that a lot of contamination was happening because facilities were taking the contents of what was then allowed a federally empty container, which contains a 55-gallon drum might still hold 1 inch of liquid in the bottom, and pouring it on the ground and then cleaning out the container. And that is why we came up with our very stringent standard of what constitutes an empty container. We recently sent our 1988-89 contaminated container document that we created to EPA headquarters. And they are looking at that, and they, I believe, have recently come out with a proposed rule, or will soon be coming out with a proposed rule for how EPA will start to regulate empty containers more stringently than they do now. But we don't have any plans to change currently our empty container rule. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana.
All right, it looks like we have no more questions or comments at the moment. So thanks everyone for the meaningful input.
Great. And yeah, we have a whole other section to talk about too. So why don't we close this section out and move on to the next? Do we have a break scheduled for the next? So we're doing another 10-minute. So we'll do another 10-minute break, and then Sean and Spencer are going to discuss waste capacity.
That's good.
Cool. Thank you. See you in 10. Hey, folks, as we're getting back here and getting ourselves settled, just wanted to give a nod to the time. This next section has been running just for presentation about 25 to 27 minutes. And so I just wanted to give folks a heads up, since that's going to be bumping up right up until 4, and that's how long we've had this scheduled for, was until 4. However, we're able to stay after that, so we just wanted to flag it that it'll likely go longer with Q&A, and then there's a wrap up at the end. That's only usually only a couple of minutes.
Okay, it's now 3:35. We're going to go ahead and start this workshop back up again. So without spending too much time opening up again, let's just move this on to the next section, which is capacity planning.
Thank you, Alejandro. My name is Sean Browning. I'm the senior engineer on the team, and I'll be discussing a little bit about our approach to capacity planning in this section. Next slide, please. Now, when we approach hazardous waste management planning, there are a few key considerations. How can California generators manage their hazardous waste within a preferred hierarchy, as was discussed in our first hazardous waste management report? We need to understand the current supply and demand of the hazardous waste management system within this hierarchy. To do this, we need to explore more opportunities to improve DTSC's abilities to use and improve current reporting systems, both within DTSC and in other agencies. And we need to understand generators' access to proper hazardous waste management capacity to protect human health and the environment. Next slide, please. For everyone that has read our first report, California's approach to hazardous waste management incorporates the concept of a hierarchy in waste management. The structure of this hierarchy has source reduction as our highest priority, followed by hazardous waste recycling, treatment, and then finally land disposal. Next slide. To increase the most preferred areas of waste management hierarchy, the hazardous waste management system will have to increase access for waste to be managed within these areas. If hazardous waste cannot be reduced at its source, it will need to be managed as hazardous waste. If this hazardous waste cannot be recycled, it will continue to fall down this hierarchy. So you can imagine the most preferred capacity system is to have excess capacity as an inverted pyramid. Next slide. If you want to understand hazardous waste generation and its impact on the hazardous waste management system, US EPA has provided the simplified diagram. On the left-hand side, you have hazardous waste generators. These generators can be businesses or even the general population. If these generators cannot treat or recycle these materials and waste, then they will need to be managed offsite in one of three management methods: recycling the waste so it can be reused, treatment of the waste to reduce the hazardous components, or for final disposal in a secure landfill. Next slide. In our report, we quantified hazardous waste generation and where hazardous waste is being managed. However, there are many different data sources to try to quantify additional areas, and we believe we have opportunities to expand our research in future reports. In the area of source reduction, we have identified a few data systems that give us more insight, like the toxic release inventory, known as TRI, or the biennial reports. Other areas may be around on-site management of hazardous waste that can be seen in the California Environmental Reporting System. All of these reporting systems have different owners and communicate different information. Next slide, please. To get a better understanding of how hazardous waste is being managed by generators versus hazardous waste management facilities, we started a review of the 2021 generator reports that are submitted to the California Environmental Reporting System, also known as CERS. Here, I have provided a delineation of when hazardous waste is being managed by generators versus commercial facilities. Above the dashed line, we see the maximum amount of waste generators are allowed to treat or recycle at their own facilities per one of the three lower tiered permits. This can include activities like solvent distillation, acid-base neutralization, or even bioremediation of benzene and wastewater. And below that dashed line, we see the amount of hazardous waste that was manifested to commercial hazardous waste management facilities in 2021. So far, we found that the quantity of on-site management of hazardous waste can be managed by generators could be nearly 10 times higher than off-site management. These numbers will increase as our analysis is yet to include two of California's largest counties, Los Angeles County and Orange County. This review of on-site management has been very time-consuming and requires the team to pore over thousands of PDF files. We hope to explore opportunities to streamline this data gathering process in the future, with the future completion of the CERS NextGen project being led by Cal EPA. Next slide, please. Many comments we received from you were related to the need of waste to be reduced, or how hazardous waste generation may have increased since the state hasn't developed pollution prevention strategies since the loss of the active waste reduction programs. We agree that waste reduction is a crucial component to hazardous waste management, and we also agree that the strategies for waste reduction should be developed, and source reduction should be part of the strategy, as Kayla discussed earlier. As is one of the reasons why our team has highlighted waste reduction and are working to better understand source reduction. Lastly, we want to reiterate that data from the hazardous waste tracking system shows manifested waste generation has decreased over time. To expand on our hazardous waste management report, here is a 21-year chart or 21-year chart of manifested hazardous waste generation in California. And we have seen the amount of hazardous waste being generated and shipped on hazardous waste manifests has decreased since the year 2000. Next slide, please. So have we seen California's manifested hazardous waste generation has been trending lower in the last few decades. The theme of some comments we received from you were related to better tracking and of source reduction and the need to make data sources more cohesive. There appears to be multiple databases that try to quantify source reduction activities by hazardous waste generators. So our future reports will explore how to get access and use these data systems. Next slide. One of these data systems on source reduction is the toxic release inventory, as mentioned earlier, and is also known as TRI. TRI is a US EPA database that tracks the release of certain toxic chemicals from certain facilities involved in the areas like manufacturing, metal mining, chemical manufacturing, or hazardous waste treatment. However, TRI does not track all hazardous waste generation or track all of hazardous waste. Eligible facilities annually report an estimated weight of chemicals released to the environment or managed through recycling, energy recovery, or treatment. TRI currently serves as one potential tool for our current research. Next slide. We plan to work with US EPA, but we have started some of this research into TRI data, so we wanted to provide a brief preview. For 2010 through 2020, the most used activity to reduce waste generation was good operating practices. This consists of improvements of scheduling or record keeping, changing production schedules, or introduction of inline product quality monitoring. Following good operating practices, we see process modifications or spill and leak preventions as the most reported source reduction activity. Next slide. A number of TRI reporting codes were retired and consolidated at the end of 2020. So in 2021 through 2022, we saw similar trends with operating practices and training related activities being the most prevalent, with process equipment modifications followed closely behind. Next slide. If a hazardous waste cannot be reduced at the source or managed on site, it will need to be managed off site. The ability to manage hazardous waste depends on capacity and accessibility to the types of facilities that are needed to properly manage hazardous waste. Every year, Californians generate waste. They generate hazardous waste, and that hazardous waste generation is a demand on the hazardous waste management system. In our report, we saw non-RCRA contaminated soil was the state's largest manifested hazardous waste stream. Due to the science and management access, non-RCRA contaminated soil currently has limited recycling or treatment capacity. Consequently, we see almost all of the contaminated soil being managed at landfills throughout the nation. After the release of our report, we did receive comments asking for our planning efforts to restrict or ban the shipment of hazardous waste to other states. However, the Commerce Clause listed in the US Constitution prevents states from restricting interstate commerce. Next slide. Using this data from our report, we quantified the state's average annual manifested hazardous waste demand on the hazardous waste management system. Here we've organized these waste streams into similar format as US EPA's capacity assessment report, which US EPA uses to analyze the nation's availability of hazardous waste treatment or disposal capacity to ensure adequate capacity throughout the country. With that, I'll turn it over to Spencer.
All right, thanks, Sean. This is Spencer Eberhard again. I'm an environmental scientist, and I'm working with the unit looking into universal waste capacity, and going to be sharing some of our findings for that and how it relates to the plan going forward. So to preface, it is important to recognize that capacity is not only manifested waste, such as what has been discussed by Sean so far, but also unmanifested waste, such as universal waste. It's often abbreviated as UW. Universal waste is just one type of unmanifested waste, which means a manifest, as seen on the right of the slide here, is not required at every stage. Other unmanifested wastes we've talked about today, like treated wood waste and used oil filters. But here we are only going to be looking at universal waste. So let's start with the question: what is universal waste? Universal waste is hazardous waste that is generated in abundance by everybody. This includes households and businesses. This means when somebody gets a new laptop or a phone and wants to get rid of the old one, that is generating universal waste, electronic devices in this situation. Because this waste is so commonly generated, it has allowed streamlined standards compared to other hazardous waste. The lack of a manifest is just one part of these streamlined standards. These streamlined standards are allowed with the rationale that making it easier for generators to discard their waste will not only reduce the instances of illegal dumping, but also promote recycling and reuse. However, it is important that I emphasize streamlined does not equate to less safe. In fact, it is the opposite, as each type of these universal waste has its own regulations and standards, so that both safety and ease of management are accounted for. So the key thing to remember here, the more we collect universal waste, the more that waste can be managed safely. So with that, next slide, please. Now, as a recap, California has its own categories of universal waste. Some are carried over from the federal categories, and some are unique to California. California chooses to identify 8 types of universal waste. The 4 highlighted at the top of the slide are the additional categories recognized by California, but not federally. These are, and going from top to bottom, CRTs, and CRT stands for cathode ray tubes. The intact cathode ray tubes that were inside, say, those old CRT televisions, that's why they're called CRTs. Then there's CRT glass, which is the broken down CRTs that we just talked about, when they're no longer intact. So they're connected in that way. But they're unique, distinct categories. Then there's photovoltaic modules, solar panels. We've talked about those a bit today. And then electronic devices. When I say electronic devices, I want to clarify these don't include what are called electrical devices, or electrical like equipment, like a simple toaster. Think like phones, computers, flat screen TVs, stuff that has, like complex circuitry in it. Now, the rest of these categories on this slide are universal waste as well, but they're also recognized by the federal system. Now, each of these universal wastes have their own regulations dictating how they are to be handled, with an emphasis on safety and recycling. To further clarify universal waste beyond the list in the prior slide, here are some actual pictures. Now, this slide's a lot, so let's go through it picture by picture. At the top left are batteries. You probably recognize, like AA's, D and C, and 9-volt. Those fall into batteries, and those are just some of the batteries that fall into universal waste. There's also rechargeable batteries, but just to give an idea, visualize it. Now, top middle, we are looking at some old phones, smartphones. Everybody's probably got some. At the top right are the photovoltaic modules, or PVs, in the case of solar panels. Pretty distinct visually. Now, at the bottom left are 2 types of fluorescent lamps. And lastly, at the bottom right, within this collage is a collage of aerosol cans. Now, there's so many different types of universal waste, I couldn't even begin to include all of them here, but I hope this just communicates how ubiquitous these wastes are. I assume many of you have some of these at home, a can of WD-40, some light bulbs, AA batteries. In fact, are you using a laptop or phone to view this workshop right now? Well, the point being, we all generate these wastes, and they're not likely to go away. So then what DTSC can do is make sure as much of these wastes are collected as possible. This is how capacity planning is involved. The intention of universal waste regulation then is to increase the collection of the waste, as this correlates to proper handling and recycling. I've said that a lot so far, but it's a key point. In this way, collecting universal waste is an essential part of capacity planning, and is why Health and Safety Code 25135 requires the hazardous waste plan to assess these universal waste streams. However, there are limited options for measuring universal waste. We mentioned it was unmanifested, so there have to be different avenues for us to recognize this waste stream. So we're assessing the current reporting requirements, because there are some, to see if they are sufficient. But We want to try to find line because too many reporting requirements might make it harder for people to properly manage their universal waste. We need data for the plan to see that universal waste is being collected as directed by Health and Safety Code 25135, but we cannot compromise these streamlined standards that are essential for the universal waste program success. This table shows a summary of destinations for universal waste and the quantity of universal waste exported to other countries. This is just an estimate from different available data sources because, as mentioned, universal waste not tracked with manifest. Non-empty aerosol cans, lamps, and batteries are categories of universal waste with some data gaps, so they are not portrayed on this particular, graph. While most universal waste is shipped to a destination within the United States, as shown on the graph, there's some exported, outside the country. This graph shows an example of some efforts that we've made to quantify collection and plan for capacity. As the prior graph showed, there is significant demand for universal waste and the ability to recycle and adequately manage it. DTSC currently has some reporting requirements that provide metrics for universal waste, albeit less extensive for the manifested waste. This chart is pulled from the 2023 Hazardous Waste Report. Highly suggest you check it out after the workshop or when you get a chance for more details. But this chart in particular details some of the data sources that inform the report's metrics on universal waste, like that prior graph. I mentioned some data gaps during the prior slide. An example of these data gaps are seen in this chart. With lamps and non-empty aerosol cans, you'll see it says information unavailable. Well, if that's the case, how can we assess them? Some data was still obtained for those waste streams due to CalRecycle's Household Hazardous Waste Program and its associated Form 303s. So lamps and aerosol cans are not a complete data gap, and perhaps these forms are sufficient. Another data gap stems from the data source for batteries, the DTSC Rechargeable Battery Survey, as it says on the chart. This is a data gap because the survey does not include the small single-use batteries. It only includes rechargeable batteries. Furthermore, this survey is compiled entirely from voluntarily submitted data compared to, say, a required form. So while this survey serves as a valuable reference, it's not the full picture for batteries. We encourage you to read the report again. You can look at all these sort of data sources on your own time as well. It's very interesting, and we go into further detail in the report. Now the goal is now to provide kind of an idea of, now that we've gone further into universal waste, some of the avenues that we are going down to maximize universal waste collection and provide guidance in the plan for their management. This slide shows just two that are currently being examined. The first focuses on the annual reports for electronic devices that are uploaded to the UED database. This UED database provided us the data we use for electronic devices on the hazardous waste report. In quantifying this data, it was noted that regulations allow electronic devices to be reported in count or weight. Count means devices were recorded on annual reports as individuals, regardless of size. Consider that electronic devices can vary greatly from the size of a computer to a phone. And that's our thought process, so that when we recognize this, we felt that it would make sense to learn the rationale for why this was permitted in the first place. We want to ascertain if changing this form requirement to reporting weight would be better, or if it's, it gives better metrics for measuring universal waste collection. But we have received feedback, though, that sometimes it is helpful for handlers or collectors to report and count, as they don't have the means to measure the devices they get. So we just want to communicate that we are learning, and we want to hear if you got any feedback or information from boots on the ground, if you know about this. It's all about the learning process for the planning. Now, the next potential avenue I want to discuss is within our observation of data regarding handled universal waste by county. We have a section within the report where we saw several counties that reported low to zero collection of universal waste, and sort of the zeros stood out. As one of the goals of the universal waste is to make it as easy as possible for people to discard their universal waste. Seeing zero collection in some counties, it's compelled us to want to verify that all counties have sufficient opportunities to manage their universal waste. Making certain all residents of California are not onerously burdened to manage their universal waste is critical to capacity planning. So that's a whole lot about universal waste, but that's all I'm sharing right at this moment. We pass the baton back to Sean, and he'll share the rest of the slides on capacity planning. Thanks.
Thank you, Spencer. Perfect. Now we spoke a little bit about demand of hazardous waste capacity. So now we should probably talk about the supply of hazardous waste capacity within California. As we discussed in our 2023 report, we saw the number of hazardous waste facilities that had an operating hazardous waste permit has decreased from more than 400 in the 1980s to less than 100 still present today. This analysis allowed for the understanding of the number of permitted facilities and not the amount of capacity per each facility, as this analysis would have needed additional time and resources. And this process is something we are reviewing so we can understand how to do this well in the future. A potential explanation for a portion of this decline may be the national consolidation and restructuring within the hazardous waste management industry that has been observed by US EPA. In addition to the process of obtaining a new permit from DTSC and to begin operations can be costly and take years to complete. These factors then incentivize companies to pursue operations within other states, and consequently decreasing these costs or improving these processing times for new permits may facilitate additional management capacity within California. Also from our report, about half of the overall manifested waste generation since 2010 gets shipped out of state. We see much of these hazardous waste streams going to Utah, Arizona, and Nevada. Waste may be shipped to other states for a few reasons. First, California doesn't have a commercial incinerator, as we discussed earlier, and federal treatment standards require some RCRA waste to be incinerated. Second, one of the two California hazardous waste landfills may not be accepting waste at the time of generation, or since California identifies more waste as hazardous, most other states are not required to manage California's non-RCRA waste as a hazardous waste, so disposal processes or cost may be decreased in those other states. When we speak about the supply of hazardous waste management capacity, we need to speak about two different types of capacity. First is the throughput capacity of a hazardous waste facility. Throughput capacity is the maximum amount of material or waste a facility can process within a given year. These can be seen in recycling facilities, treatment facilities, much like a hazardous waste incinerator. Secondly is disposal capacity. Once a landfill is full, the landfill will need to be closed and monitored and cannot continue to receive waste unless other landfill capacity is available or becomes available. Supply and demand imbalances of hazardous waste management system can have impacts to Californians and its communities. First, it can lead to illegal disposal. Here, we pulled a few examples of illegal disposal of hazardous waste. The top two examples come from Imperial's IVAN system, where IVAN is the identifying violations affecting neighborhood system. The top left was an abandoned battery. On the top right was abandoned used oil containers. And finally, on the bottom, we see 2,600 gallons of illegally abandoned hand sanitizer that was dumped in the Lucerne Valley last year in September. Second is the hazardous waste cannot be managed in a more preferred management method if it will fall down the hierarchy that we spoke about earlier. Thus, if it cannot be recycled, it may need to be treated or disposed of. And then finally, there can be impacts to federal funding for new Superfund cleanup projects, and we can discuss that a little bit more right now. Next slide, please. Just for everyone's references, there's a lot of information here. We're providing it mostly as reference. I'll walk through this a little bit. So for those unfamiliar with CERCLA, also known as Superfund, CERCLA is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. CERCLA authorizes the President and the US EPA to respond to releases of hazardous substances into the environment. One of the amendments of CERCLA included 104C9 that requires, in summary, states to assure that future available hazardous waste management capacity before new CERCLA trust fund money can be used for remedial action within a state. The adequate capacity will need to be for the next 20 years and are within state or outside the state in accordance to interstate or regional agreements. Next slide. One supply and demand imbalance that we have been monitoring is within hazardous waste incineration. The 2020 pandemic triggered a series of events that disrupted hazardous waste management system nationally. In 2021, US EPA sent out a memo that they became aware of a backlog of hazardous waste incinerators, and some facilities were no longer receiving accepting hazardous waste designated for incineration. This backlog created a national issue with managing these hazardous waste streams, and this backlog has yet to be resolved, as we discussed earlier. California currently does not have a hazardous waste incinerator, nor are any currently proposed. And the closest hazardous waste incinerator capacity is within the state of Utah. We have received your comments regarding the state hazardous waste incineration capacity or in-state hazardous waste incineration capacity and found the comments at odds with each other. The persistent backlog added to our justification to research incinerable waste streams in our source reduction section, as Kayla discussed earlier, as well as the need to understand generators' access to capacity in our planning process. Now, I spoke about what has happened and what is currently happening in the hazardous waste management system. So now we can take a look forward to future generation. Hazardous waste management report reviewed data from 2010 to 2021, and our current capabilities only allow DTSC to monitor active hazardous waste management or hazardous waste generation. Therefore, to improve our planning efforts, we will be evaluating our current forecasting capabilities to better predict future trends in hazardous waste generation and its impact on management capacity. Next slide. And with that, we can open up to questions, feedback.
Okay, so we have one from Amar Rivera on the question and answer. I didn't catch what was said, but this is in regard to shipping to outside states. What about the U.S. Constitution and interstate commerce? Does it mean California can send waste wherever they want?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for your comment. So per the comments we received during our reporting process, we received a lot of comments around banning or restricting waste from going out of state. In our evaluation, and that has been taking place, that is not something we were able to do at this time from our understanding due to the Commerce Clause that is in the United States Constitution, since hazardous waste is deemed as a commerce, and a state is not allowed to provide any laws that end up restricting the flow of those types of materials or waste. Hopefully that helps.
And let me add on to the end of that. The second part of the question was, does it mean California can send waste wherever they want? And no, two parts to it. One, California generators, and we'll talk about it as generators in California, are required to send waste to approved facilities. They can't just send it wherever they want. It has to go to an approved facility, and that's very dependent upon what the waste is. You have RCRA waste and non-RCRA waste. RCRA waste have to go to a RCRA approved facility. Non-RCRA waste, those are the wastes that are identified as hazardous in California, have to go to a permitted hazardous waste management facility in California. However, if non-RCRA waste are sent out of state, many states don't recognize it or identify that waste as hazardous. And so it's able to be managed at other types of facilities.
Okay, we have a hand raised here from the participants. Cynthia Babish, go ahead and speak when you're ready. You're unmuted.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for the presentation today. It was a lot of information. I think that my comments are not made necessarily to one particular audience. I think that for a long time, the way that waste have been generated in California have been misguided. And it's time now to tighten restrictions. And once somebody's had the freedom to pretty much do to maintain the level of waste that we are generating in California and other states, it's sometimes really hard to dial people back. But part of what I think we're grappling with is a moral dilemma. Do we increase standards for protections in California, knowing that our wastes are going to other states that don't have those same protections? And so if you try to grapple with that, other than looking at a moral dilemma and how we change the way that we consume, that's going to be a problem. And I don't know that you'll be able to get to that. And I think one of the good examples that we've heard recently is from Cal Recycle, where they've put in the responsibility back on manufacturers for the production of plastics. I want us to be bold and take those same steps. If things are not good for the environment, our planet is dying. We are nothing without it. And if we don't start protecting our planet and stop the harms that we're causing, what's the point for the next generation? So I, again, appreciate all the detailed information. I've been watching the bouncing ball with you for a very long time. And now it's time to make some really hard decisions. It's time for the Department of Toxic Substances Control and other regulators to regulate. And the environmental justice communities are here to help you do that very difficult job. And if there are authorities that you don't have now that you deem are important to get waste management under control, then we need to partner to make that happen. So I'm trying to be delicate. I'm a little bit upset that I can't see who the participants are. I feel very controlled. And DTSC has a really bad habit of doing this when you have webinars and these conversations. And so I don't feel like I'm in a protected space. So I'm trying to be measured on what I'm saying. If you hear hesitation in my voice, that's the reason why. So thank you. I will remain partnered in this effort because it's really important to my community as well, who does have stockpiled incinerable wastes that we're keeping in our community, because we just don't want to shift the burden. We're not going to shift the burden. So we need to find other ways to deal with the hazardous waste problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cynthia. I will say I'm looking forward to joining you guys next week at the symposium.
Okay, another question from Victoria Reiser. When will this recording be available to rewatch?
Couple weeks, I think. Yeah, it takes a little time to get it shipshape to post. So I'd say a couple weeks.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. So just toss that in there as well. Thank you. Also from Michael Caprio. This is a general question relative to many of the topics discussed today. At a high level, can DTSC staff provide a brief overview of what the process would be for updating statutory requirements or updating current regulations? Realize it depends on the complexity of a change and type of material being envisioned. Also, based on comments made today, one could assume that this process would commence after the first phase of the hazardous waste management plan is released early next year.
I think I can touch on some of this, and Diana might have to fill in where I'm missing information. So there's two parts to that. There's the statute and the regs. The statutes are the laws that tell us what we have to do, and then the regulations are those so that filler information that tells you how to do it, how to meet the laws or the requirements of the law. So there's two separate processes for both of those types of rulemaking or lawmaking. And within those, there's their own processes. So for statutory requirements, that would be like a change to a statute or a law. That's typically requires a sponsor or a legislative action to happen. So that would be one of the legislators doing something. And there's various ways or various processes within that process, just that general category. And then in regulations, that is something that we would implement some kind of rulemaking to do. And each of these has their own timeframes. Statutes, I'm not as familiar with the lawmaking, I guess, seasons, for lack of a better term. And Diana can probably speak to that a little better than I can. In regulations, we can propose a regulation, and it can take a while to process. My understanding is that some can take up to like 2 years to move their way through the process of rulemaking. Some can go faster, some can go slower. The second part of this question from Mike is also based on comments made today. One could assume that this process would commence after the first phase of hazardous waste management plan is released early next year. That I think so. They're kind of, I think they're slightly different. For statutes, that's kind of out of our control. If a lawmaker wants to go and write a bill, they can do that. And that's not necessarily sponsored by DTSC. For reg changes, that might be something for us to consider doing prior to or after. It depends on what it is. They're regulatory packages or rulemaking packages. So that's it depends on what it is, I guess, is the best answer for that. With that, Diana, do you or
just to add, sorry, Mike, just to add one more extra thing. That you touched on the date of early next year. That is when our target date to submit a draft plan to the board. And the board needs to run their process laid out in 25-135. I believe it's little e, that needs to then adopt or approve that plan. So there will still be some potential time to run through that to completion.
Yes. Thank you, Sean.
And finally, from Karen Loricella, as far as I know, the only mercury recycler back in New Jersey closed down. I have one hydrometer with a good amount of HG, and the contractor wants to ship it to Canada, but it's very expensive. Is there an alternative to have the HG recycled in the United States? It said on the slide, there is HG collector website. Can you please comment? Thank you.
Yeah, so I believe the slide you're referring to is the data sources we had for some of the universal waste. We referenced a mercury collection third-party website. So there are some stewardship programs, nonprofit corporations that are involved in the process of collecting and transporting these mercury-containing equipment. For the report, we received information for that from one of those nonprofit corporations. And you can find them online. Specifically, we do not mention exactly, but there's mention of, say, a facility that we were referred to in Wisconsin that deals with that. I'm not sure if they're still operating, but
yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
That was where the data came from that we're referring to in that slide and the report.
And I do not see any other questions or comments. We do have some. We have a thank you, very helpful, from Michael Caprio. And we do have a hand raised from Karen Loricella. So Karen, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. You can go ahead and speak anytime you'd like.
Hi. So if what happens on the mercury recycler, what happens if the Wisconsin facility is closed down? Then what are going to be my alternatives? Just to end up sending it to Canada and spending, thousands of dollars, because that's what it's going to take to get this one piece to Canada. But it's not like we're going to not have any more. There's probably some still in the facility here and there, either mercury thermostats or some other kind of hidden in the scientific labs. So I'm kind of wondering what we're supposed to be doing on that.
Karen, I think it's a great question, and I think it's a bit specific for the information that we have in front of us right now. Okay. Can you send that to us in an email, and we can either try and address it or find someone that we know of that has that knowledge offhand?
Okay, sure. And who's the person I address the email to?
Oh, go ahead and send it to our just the hazardous waste management plan email box. I think it comes up at the end of the towards the end of the presentation. I'm sorry, it's out of my head right now. Specifically the whole correct email address. So I would wait for that to pop up and then go ahead and send it to us. You could also submit it on, there's going to be a post workshop survey. So that could be another way to submit it. So there's a couple options. Hopefully one of those will work. If not, you can look on our website and we have our email. There's a button for our email there as well.
Okay.
So,
Okay,
yeah.
great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks,
I
Karen.
appreciate all the information.
Okay.
And it looks like we got, oh, go ahead.
Oh, good. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just saying that we don't have any more questions.
Awesome. Okay. I was saying the same thing. Cool. Oh, and it looks like Felice dropped the email address in the chat. So thank you, Felice, saving me on that. Okay. With that, yeah, why don't we close her out?
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. All right. And thank you everybody for hanging with us for a little bit longer today. Got a lot of good questions, good comments, good conversations. So I think it's very valuable. So what we're going to do now to close out is, and again, I'm Felice Takamatsu, the Associate Governmental Program Analyst for the unit. And just want to say we appreciate the feedback provided today, since one of the main goals of today's workshop was to hear directly from you. And this is the beginning of an iterative planning process, and your continued collaboration is very important at every step. So thank you very much. And to give a little recap, we first reviewed where we've been, then our team shared what we've been working on for the development of the plan for each of the focus areas of environmental justice, waste criteria, waste reduction, and capacity planning. And throughout our meeting, we're able to hear from you and have some great discussions on various topics. And those discussions are extremely valuable and will help us in drafting the plan and develop future workshops as well. So now we're going to take a look at the next steps. So next slide, please. All right, so based on this timeline, we're currently in Q2, which includes hosting today's workshop and presenting updates at the Board of Environmental Safety meetings, which are additional opportunities for us to hear directly from you as well. And then in Q3 or the summer of 2024, some of our next steps include more engagement opportunities to hear from you, either in the form of subject-specific workshops, getting into more complicated subjects to dive into technical issues, and discuss significant trade-offs to be considered, and also opportunities for one-on-one meetings with interested stakeholders. And as you can see on the timeline, throughout Q2 and Q3, our unit is also working on drafting the plan. The general structure of the plan is a document listing the goals and actions for each of the focus areas, and for any goals and actions with more detailed explanations, those will likely be included in an appendix. And then following along in the timeline in Q4, that's when we'll be finalizing the draft plan. Then in Q1 of 2025, the draft plan is due to the Board of Environmental Safety in March. Next slide, please. So once we submit the draft to the Board of Environmental Safety, they'll start their approval process per Health and Safety Code 25135. And this includes holding a minimum or at least 3 public hearings to receive public comments, so more opportunities to get feedback. And then the Board of Environmental Safety and DTSC are to consider the comments and revise the draft hazardous waste management plan as deemed appropriate. Next slide, please. All right, so we encourage you to continue your involvement and we want to hear from you. We invite you to visit our website for more information and subscribe to our e-list. You'll get updates, including when this workshop recording will be available. I am dropping a post-workshop survey link into the chat now for you to complete and provide additional input as well. And then if we go to the next slide, we actually do have an opportunity for any follow-up questions or feedback. So now's the opportunity if you'd like to share any other input with us.
If there are follow-up questions or comments, please fill out the survey that we're sending out. It's hopefully going to be helpful for us. In addition, thank you everybody for your comments and feedback today. It's very helpful, and again, your participation is very welcome. So with that, let's close it out and onwards and upwards. We will plan to have additional workshops coming up later this summer.